Former religious people, what made you stop believing in your faith? I grew up Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, the whole 9 yards. I went to a private Christian college for my first degree, determined to figure out which denomination was correct. My first shock was discovering that about half of my professors, despite being very Christian, were Democrats. I had been brought up being told that it was impossible to be both a Democrat and a Christian, but my professors very clearly knew the Bible and lived by Jesus's teaching, so that was the first major chink in my worldview. Then my biology and astronomy courses taught evolution, and I had to adjust my framework to a God of the Gaps view. At one point my courses were history of world art I, ancient Near East through early Middle Ages, world civilization I, and the Old Testament. One of the courses was the odd one out when it came to what events happened where, when, guess which. Further courses in apologetics and Christian philosophy and church history showed me that most of the schisms happened because of ridiculous petty human reasons, dressed up like some sort of profound religious truth. And when we compared secular philosophers to Christian philosophers, I found that de Beauvoir and Sartre made a hell of a lot more sense than Kierkegaard and Aquinas. Finally, I decided that if all of the denominations were just human creations, I would go to the OG and started attending the Greek Orthodox Church in town. It was awesome. After every service there was coffee hour, which meant that all the yayas brought tons of food and their husbands brought their latest batch of home distilled ouzo, and I'd stagger back to my dry campus after church totally hammered. My road called the priest a couple times because he didn't believe I'd been in church we were required to attend every week, but the priest always confirmed I showed up every week. Ha ha. Anyways, I eventually went back to school to become a paramedic, and during anatomy and physiology learned that pretty much everything I'd been taught about reproduction and fetal development timelines was wrong, and how vaccines and harm reduction strategies for public health concerns worked. And at some point the last bit of belief went away. I was in denial for a bit, and tried to pick up something. Anything else? I dabbled in Hinduism and paganism for a bit, but couldn't make myself believe anymore, at least not like I had believed in Jesus as a child, and anything else felt like a disappointing imitation of that, like I was just going through the motions and pretending. What's funny is that when I was religious, I was scared all the time, of demons, of sin, of displeasing God. As soon as I acknowledged to myself that we are the inevitable products of an entropic process that started billions of years ago, I felt peace. I found a new purpose in working to reduce suffering. I am a much kinder, nicer, happier person than I was when I was religious. Raised Methodist. When I heard people believe murderers, pedophiles and other horrible people can be saved and accepted into heaven, but someone that doesn't have faith, but is an otherwise amazing and good person will suffer in hell for eternity. That is the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Even if that is true, why would I want to serve an egotistical God like that? A God that cares more about you having faith in him than actually being a good person. Give me eternal agony over that. Born and raised a Jehovah's Witness. Left almost 4 years ago at 20. Hypocrisy, lies, fear-mongering, and I just generally don't like a lot of those people. Also the part where I have to spend every second of the day either studying or preaching, and give up on my hopes, dreams, goals, and aspirations. I was raised Catholic. CCD. Church every Sunday, the whole nine. During my final year of CCD, right before I was about to make my confirmation when I was 15, I got pregnant. My CCD teacher and the priest at my church came to visit me in the hospital, where they told me I wouldn't be allowed back to church anymore because of the sin I had made. They were not kind about it. When my baby was like 4 months old, I bumped into my CCD teacher while walking my daughter, and she asked me when I was going to come by to have her baptized. She said that even though I wasn't a part of the church anymore, I could still at least do that, and the priest would do it out of kindness. What? I laughed in her face. Never had the baby baptized and realized the whole idea of religion was dumb. I still believed in a God for a while, but just naturally came to the conclusion that God is not real. Call my baby a sin? You. She's 21 now and in her 3rd year of college, and we had it pretty rough, but we made it. She was no sin. The realization that basically all human cultures had religions. You can go to every edge of the earth to find isolated, uncontacted societies. and they have gods they worship. There are thousands and thousands of religions, and not one reason to think any one of them is special. Why don't you believe in God? That's a loaded question. How did you pick one among thousands? The answer is painfully obvious to anyone who isn't religious. I grew up in the rural southern US. Most of the churches around us were Baptist, and my father was Church of Christ. He kept an ancient King James Bible on his nightstand. When I was 8 or 10, we visited a family member out of state. She attended a Pentecostal church. The people in the Pentecostal church were speaking in tongues, singing and shouting, and carrying on. In particular, the speaking in tongues was extremely strange to me. I'd never seen it in any of the Baptist or Church of Christ services I'd been to, and it shook 10-year-old me to see grown adults seemingly losing control of their faculties. The stark difference between Pentecostal worship and Baptist worship, I think, raised some deep questions for me. If the Pentecostals are right, why doesn't God allow the Baptists to speak in tongues too? Why does he treat congregation A in one way, and congregation B in another? There would seem to be no reason for it. If the Pentecostals are wrong, how can adults be so deeply misled? And if they can be wrong, can't the Baptists and everyone else be wrong too? This, I think, was the first inkling I had that religion has more to do with individuals' preferences and beliefs than with any objective reality. But I was still a believer for the next couple of decades, to the point that I had the idea in my head that doubt was equivalent to blasphemy. I didn't allow myself to think too much about it because I was afraid God would hurt people I loved if I didn't believe. Then I started asking myself, what kind of God takes hostages? I started going to atheism and reading snippets and excerpts of various content. I started listening to Penn Jillette's Sunday School podcast, where he talks a great deal about atheism. I read Sagan's Demon-Haunted World, learning about Joseph Smith and Mormonism, which was always ridiculed by the Baptists I grew up around, gave me an inkling of how religions get started. Joseph Smith was clearly not credible to me or to the religious authorities I had respected. Similarly, I followed with interest the history and progress of L. Ron Hubbard and the Church of Scientology, and this gave me perspective on how people can get carried away with religions. Why couldn't the same have happened in the 1st century? I spent a lot of time debating scripture with my brother-in-law, who is a minister, asking about problematic passages in the Bible, addressing the question of theodicy and so forth. I had a lot of questions about why the Apostle Paul, who never met Jesus and made many claims that drastically changed the face of the faith, was not considered a charlatan. His content only seemed to be in the Bible because he arrived on the scene at the right time in history. The minister could only say, "It's an article of faith," which to me, translated to, "I believe this Paul for no good reason, and because if I don't, then this thing I've devoted my life to doesn't make sense." It felt like a choice. The same as choosing to believe that gemstones have powers. And at some point I looked at the road behind me and realized I couldn't get back to where I had come from. Religious claims simply seemed to have lost credibility. If you can imagine if a Martian came down and you tried to explain Christianity to him in 5 minutes. I felt like the Martian in that scenario. You believe what? Why? I don't harbor any disrespect for religious folks. I grasp why they believe what they believe, and while I have a personal commitment to the truth, I am not entirely certain that every person's life would be made better by atheism. People take a great deal of solace in religion, and I wouldn't rob them of it, but I can't get back there from where I am now. People spending more time judging people than trying to be a good person. My grandma was haranguing me because I don't care about same-sex marriage and I am pro-choice. I spend a lot of time actually putting work into my community and she just spends time judging people like it's her job. My daughter was diagnosed with brain cancer just months after my 24-year-old sister-in-law passed away from cancer as well. It's hard to still believe when good people suffer and terrible people prevail. Years of silence, no answers to prayer, and the constant proliferation of evil at the expense of the good and just. If there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness. A phrase that was carved on the walls of a concentration camp cell during World War II by a Jewish prisoner. I was raised in a Protestant Christian church and they tried to make me believe in conspiracies like Rihanna and Lady Gaga being in the Illuminati. Also, that we should be against equality because we should stay traditional. So marriage should be between a man and a woman and they are obligated to have kids, or else they're failures. Once I talked about the time I had sleep paralysis and the Sunday school teacher told me it was a demon sent by Satan, not to mention another teacher kept making racist, sexist and homophobic remarks all the time. I'm not about that life. I'm agnostic now. My mother loved me unconditionally. I wasn't such a up, but then out of the blue she decided to get religious. After that everything that was normally okay, listening to music, being friends with girls, going to school functions, was forbidden. Not only that, because I wasn't able to adapt to the bullshit rules and culture shock, I was just disowned. I'm 28 now. The last 17 years of my life with her have been unbearable and I finally had the courage to cut her off because I was tired of never being able to make my mom proud. I had to deal with a mental funeral and the fact that I basically lost my mom years ago. I couldn't reconcile that. 1. God was in control of everything. 2. God loves everyone unconditionally. 3. God was allowing very bad things to happen to the people he loves. I was in middle school history class thinking about how stupid people were for believing in the Greek gods, and then it all clicked.